Part 4, Governance. In this section, we're going to talk about, in more concrete terms, some of the ways in which we can govern these systems and how the proposals for governing these systems have been made. I'm going to start off by talking about the EU's AI regulation, which was published in relatively early 2021. And that approaches the problem of AI from a risk management perspective or risk tier. Then we'll talk about accountability, which is the kind of, I'm referring to it in a kind of non-technical sense. And I can explain that when we get to that point. And then we'll talk about performance assessments, or that's the kind of, let's say, the kind of technical way of approaching the problem. So the first point to discuss is the example of the EU's AI regulation. So we spoke in earlier section about legislation that already exists, things like anti-discrimination and so on. But now there's actually calls for a very specific AI regulation, and this is concretized in the form of the EU's proposed legislation on AI. So let's define the kind of to kind of summarize the conversation or the legislation. It approaches the problem from a risk perspective. So what does it do? It gives tiers of risk. So there's a number of tiers. At the kind of, there's the, let's say, the highest risk. I shouldn't call it high risk because they have a section that's called high risk, but the kind of highest risk is unacceptable. So this is prohibited. So examples of this are things like, and it refers to significant manipulation. So people being manipulated significantly such that it doesn't respect their personhood. And that also includes manipulation of things like minors, elders, people with disabilities, etc. It refers to prohibited systems that do social scoring. So social scoring is where you take this different data points from somebody's, let's say, whether they've paid some bill or whether they've crossed a red light, things that are not necessarily related to one another, and then just stitches them together and creates a kind of social persona and then scores that person socially. The EU is saying you can't use it in this way. I think that's a nudge against the social scoring system in China. And the other prohibited system that's explicitly mentioned is systems which do kind of biometric scanning at scale or at distance. So things like facial recognition in the public square, indiscriminate facial recognition, if you will, monitoring of people, and so on and so forth. So the next set of systems that they refer to are high-risk systems, and they don't give a explicit definition of this, but instead they just give loads and loads of case studies. So they give 18 case studies or contexts in which these systems are high risk. So some examples are things like credit worthiness or credit score of a person when they're applying for a loan or something. Recruitment systems, so when someone's going for a loan or something like that. The dispatching of emergency services, whether an ambulance or triaging in a hospital and so on and so forth. So all of these systems are considered high risk. From my reading of the legislation, it seems like any system which has a significant impact on somebody's life or life prospects is considered high risk. And those systems are deemed to require, if you will, high levels of governance and risk management. And then there are kind of low or minimal risk systems, and the only provision there is that there should be some kind of transparency or justification. So let's take, for example, a low risk system that's cited is spam detection in emails. So that's not considered a high risk system. And other systems, like if you're interacting with, let's say, a chat bot or something like that, it should be clearly communicated to the user that you're interacting with a machine learning system or with a AI system. So then the legislation goes into some of the kind of legal requirements for risk management. It talks about data governance, talks about the need for documentation, to communicate certain kind of performance metrics, robustness, accuracy, and so on. The transparency for users, so that's very much in line with the previous point about the chatbot, or generally just ensuring that customers or users of various systems understand that they're using an automated system. and the important human oversight, so ensuring that there's plenty and plenty of human oversight. So let me just kind of put the word abstract there. It's just a kind of nudge to say that the legislation is very, very loose at the moment. The legislation has been proposed. I think the call is for 2 years of consultation before the legislation can be codified. So lots and lots of kind of things will change in legislation, but the basic structure is this. So you can see in this case, there's a really concrete approach to saying, okay, we can't just leave this to, arbitrary or say individuals to make decisions or companies just to make decisions. There has to be some kind of legal structure or systematized structure to govern these systems. So it's a big event in the space of AI ethics and obviously AI fairness. So a very significant event. So what do we mean by accountability? Okay, governance in terms of accountability. So all of it is governance, if you will, is accountability, you might say, or ensures accountability. The way we were just kind of discussing it here is to say, okay, how can we ensure that there is a allocation of responsibility to appropriate parties, that there's a hierarchy of responsibility or decision making that can be clearly articulated and justified. So there's lots of approaches to saying, how can we map out this process? So at the very highest level, there's the kind of articulation of the principles. So what is the company's position on fairness? It's very important to do that, to understand that it's being met, etc. The taxonomy of accountability roles. So here we're saying, okay, what's the role of the compliance officer? What's the role of a data scientist in this? Is there an internal auditor that needs to assess this, and so on and so forth. So it's about kind of really concretely allocating the responsibility appropriately. Monitoring. So, okay, we've put in a system, we've governed it, and so on and so forth. Have we got a way to ensure that we can monitor this over time? Can we do that? Is there a reporting mechanism, even a kind of logging system? How do we access this monitoring? Is the monitoring accessible? I put their interfaces in question mark. And is there appropriate human oversight? And by that, I don't just mean, or we don't just mean, is there a human that just oversees this? Is the person qualified? Are they competent? Is it an appropriate way of using human oversight? There's now also burgeoning literature on impact assessments, which are just to say, okay, aside from the good governance of the system, taking a broader view or contextual view and saying, is this system proportional? Are we justified in using this? What's the broader social impact or impact on people? So these are kind of accountability, and I've just differentiated this because these are all, if you note, are very much about decision making, about corporate governance or governance more generally. It's not necessarily going into very deep engineering. The second kind of, if you will, assessment or governance is the performance assessment. Here we're just talking about very much assessing the engineering side of systems. And what we've noticed is, as this moves forward, is that a lot of systems, if you look at some of the data governance provisions, people can answer questions. You don't need to maybe narrate or relate or report very technical details. It seems like in the context of AI, this is probably going to be less feasible. You're going to probably have to put a bit more, let's say, technical meat on the bone. So you can do this by kind of doing stress testing, back testing and so on. You can assess the data probing, you can check for data leakage and so on and so forth. So you can do it by performance assessment. What I'm referring to here is actually by looking at how the system actually performs, not just about the broader accountability, but actually, let's say, looking into the bonnet. Now, in the context of fairness, when we do this kind of assessment, when we do the kind of technical assessment, there are fairness metrics that have emerged. I've put them all here on this slide. They fall into the two camps that we articulated earlier in the course: equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. But what's important here is that note that we have actual literature and concrete metrics that can be assessed. So, and this is important because it gives a much more, let's say, granular and concrete approach to the problem of fairness, and it moves us away from the issue of, or how do we define fairness, or what are we actually testing? So whether we agree or disagree with the various metrics, at least we can say it performs like this or that according to these metrics, which are generally held, etc., etc. And you can see in different contexts, in different industries, say in recruitment, for example, which we'll talk about in our case studies, there's some of the kind of statistics here have become, best practice to report on particular ways. So we actually have metrics to stress test, or to actually test rather, to probe and to report on. And that's a very important step in the context of AI governance. So in this section, we've talked about the regulation, just kind of concretizing how these things are becoming kind of codified or systematized. We talked about non-technical accountability, which is the kind of broader governance questions. And then we talked about fairness assessments and how you can go all the way into the level of detail of actually having fairness metrics that you actually assess and report. Thank you.